I want to once again welcome you to our study of the Bible, the Word in a Year. So this evening, we're continuing our study of the books of the New Testament. The last session that we had worked our way through the book of Romans. And this evening, what we're going to do is we're going to continue going through several of Paul's letters, and in fact two. We're going to talk about 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Like we talked about last time, much of the New Testament consists of letters. And these letters, they are written for various reasons, but often they are written by a church leader in order to provide instruction, correction, encouragement, sometimes all in the same letter. So this evening, we're going to be working through these first two letters after Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. In our New Testament canon, we have these two letters that were written by Paul to the Corinthians, the church in Corinth. And these are actually two of four letters that we know that were written by Paul to this church in Corinth. The church in Corinth, it was a church that Paul knew very well. He was very intimately aware of this church and everything going on in it. In Paul's missionary travels, he strategically traveled to this city in order to plant a church. Corinth, it was a major port city in the ancient world where there were several pagan temples, and it was a socio-economic center of the Roman world. It was this melting pot of ideas and religion. So when we look at the issues being dealt with in the church, and the issues we deal with today, we can see a lot of similarities. But in the middle of all this, Paul decides to plant this church, and he brings the light of Jesus into this darkness. So the problem is, as soon as Paul leaves this newly planted church, he begins to receive a number of reports about conflicts happening at the church. And one of the major issues that was faced by this church was divisions. The church was threatened to fall apart due to the fact that it was, in a sense, being pulled in different directions over disagreements on a variety of subjects. So Paul, he writes this first letter in order to offer guidance, teaching, and encouragement. The first letter of the church at Corinth, it can be divided into 6 different sections. The first portion of this letter concerns divisions in the church. There were a large part of the issues that were occurring in the church were due to divisions. There were other leaders that had come through Corinth after Paul had planted it, and the problem was that the Corinthians, they ended up picking favorites. They began to equate a level of spirituality or true Christian discipleship with only following this teacher or maybe that teacher. And they began to be like groupies of sorts. They rallied around a particular teacher and they ostracized others who didn't belong to their group. And Paul's response was that the church, they shouldn't give allegiance to teachers, but they should give allegiance to Christ alone. The church, it's a community centered around Jesus. The leaders, they're simply servants. So while the church may have preferred one teacher or another, a preference that isn't something that's worth dividing over. The second portion of this letter concerns sexual integrity. So Paul moves on to addressing sexual conduct within the church. There were a number of things going on in this church that included a man sleeping with his stepmother, a number of members, they were still worshiping at the local temple, and as a result, they were sleeping with the cult prostitutes as well. So we see a lot of issues happening with sexual immorality. And Paul, he was actually more disturbed by the fact that the church was fine with all of this. There's a freedom in the gospel, but it's not a freedom to sin. And Paul reminds the church that Jesus died for the consequences of their sins. If someone is a Christian, sexual integrity and purity is one of the main non-negotiable ways to respond to Jesus' love and his grace. He reminds the church that one day our physical bodies will be raised from the dead, meaning that if your body is being redeemed by Jesus now and in the future, then what you do with your body, it matters. The third portion of this letter concerns food sacrificed to idols. The Corinthians, they were divided by the consumption of meat that was sacrificed to pagan idols. There was a lot of argument and dispute about what to do with this meat. Should we eat it? Shouldn't we eat it? This meat, it would be sold in the market after it was sacrificed. And the church ended up being divided about whether they should buy this meat or not, whether they should eat it or not. And this was likely split between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Paul's point was that if you eat meat sacrificed to idols and people watch you eat it, they may conclude that you serve Jesus and also serve these other idols as well. And in that scenario, Paul says, don't eat the meat. Don't mislead others by your freedom. But as Christians, we have freedom to eat outside of the traditional Jewish kosher diet. As a new human in Christ, you're free to follow your conscience in these more debatable matters. The qualifying principle that should guide your actions is love. Love may mean denying yourself and prioritizing others above yourself. And this is the type of love that Jesus showed us, and that Paul says that we should show others as well. The fourth portion of this letter concerns orderly worship. There was issues whenever the Corinthians came together. He begins to address this chaos that was happening in the Corinthians worship gatherings. People would use their spiritual gifts in some ways to outdo one another. And the result is that it was a distraction, especially for visitors coming into their worship gatherings. Paul says a worship gathering should be a place where the Spirit is free to move. He works through all individuals, but it happens in a unified way. And Paul develops this metaphor as the church as a body. The body has unique members with unique roles. And in the same way, individuals in the church, they are unique with unique roles, but they work together in unity. The Spirit works in various ways through a variety of gifts, but all of it is done through love. The fifth portion of this letter concerns the resurrection of Jesus and the hope that it brings. There were some individuals who were in the church. They were calling Jesus' resurrection ridiculous. But Paul says that the resurrection is an indispensable part of the message of the gospel. Hundreds of witnesses, they viewed Jesus after his death, proving his validity. But the resurrection of Jesus gives hope to the believer. If he didn't die, his death would be meaningless. Jesus' victory over death gives us hope, not just in this life, but also in the next. And he concludes by saying that Jesus' resurrection is the foundation of Christian faith. The book of 1 Corinthians is all about seeing every part of life through the lens of the gospel. So Paul, he also writes a second letter to the church at Corinth that is now part of our Bibles, our biblical canon. Following Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, it appears that many in the church, they rejected his authority. And we learn from the second letter in the Bible that Paul had written, yet another letter in between these two letters that we have in our Bible. And it was a letter that was written in anguish and tears. And after a visit and the in-between letter, most of the Corinthians, they realized that they were folly, and they apologized, wanting to truly reconcile with Paul. So Paul writes 2 Corinthians in order to defend his apostolic authority and to assure them of his love and commitment. So the book of 2 Corinthians, there's three sections that we can divide it up into. First part deals with Paul's suffering and poverty being proof of his apostleship. So Paul, he begins his letter by defending his role as an apostle. He wants to have this open, honest relationship with the church and to restore this relationship that had been severed through these disagreements and their rejection of him and his authority. But we might wonder, why did they reject Paul in the first place? Well, we found out later in the letter that he was rejected because he was poor and he only earned money through manual labor. He wasn't also the best public speaker. So once they were exposed to these other wealthy, impressive, charismatic Christian leaders, they began to reject Paul. Many thought he wasn't credible because of these reasons. So he speaks to how distorted this value system truly is. True Christian leadership is not about status or self-promotion. The job of a Christian leader isn't to look important, but most importantly, to point others to Christ. His ultimate goal is to imitate Christ, and that means for Paul living the life as suffering at some times. And though his apostolic career was marked by humility, suffering, and poverty, it was all to serve the Corinthians. His way of life shows that he authentically represents Jesus. The second part of this letter deals with a plea for gospel-motivated generosity. So after this appeal, Paul moves on to address the forgotten generosity of the Corinthians. In the midst of all that was going on, the Corinthians, they forgot to send money for the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. But for Paul, it wasn't about the money, but rather it was the heart that was the problem. Jesus gave up his glorious honor, and he lowered himself like a servant. To be a Christian, we should have that same mindset. We should have that same servant mentality, being willing to forsake ourselves for the betterment of others. And the heart of the gospel is a transformed life, causing us to be more generous. The third part is an invitation to humble repentance. In the final section, Paul addresses the main source of conflict in Corinth. There are a group of individuals who Paul refers to as these super apostles, and he does it sarcastically. These individuals badmouth Paul as a poor, unsuccessful leader. And Paul goes on to take on their credentials with his own. He compares them. He's actually seen and spent time with Christ himself. But Paul says that these things aren't really what matters as a Christian. Instead, he brags about his flaws and about his weaknesses. And it's in those moments that he discovers the power of Christ. And Paul closes out this letter telling the Corinthians to examine their hearts. Their love for these super apostles and their contempt for Paul, it shows that they're not living their lives as transformed followers as Christ. The book of 2 Corinthians, it's a view into the paradox of followers of Christ. While society may value success in education, business life, personal life, and wealth, God values humility, weakness, and servants. And the challenge for the believer is to take up the cross of Christ and make it their own. We'll see you next time.